American classrooms between the 1950s and the 1990s operated under a set of rules so harsh, so humiliating, and so casually accepted that most modern parents would refuse to believe they were real. But they were. These were not rare exceptions or isolated incidents. They were policy. Here are 10 real school rules from that era that are completely banned today. Number 1. Left-handed children forced to write with their right hand. For most of human history, left-handedness was treated with suspicion. In many cultures, it was associated with evil, dishonesty, or mental weakness, and American schools in the 1950s and the 1960s carried that prejudice directly into the classroom. Teachers did not simply discourage left-handed writing, they physically prevented it. A common method was tying the child's left hand to the back of the chair with a ribbon or a piece of cloth, leaving only the right hand free. Others placed the left hand flat on the desk and struck it with a ruler every time the child instinctively reached for the pencil. Some teachers taped fingers together or put a sock over the left hand to make gripping impossible. The reasoning given to parents, when any was given at all, was that left-handed writing was messy, smeared ink, and made a child stand out in a world built for right-handers. It would be easier for them, teachers said, if they just learned the correct way. The reality was psychological damage on a massive scale. Forced switching disrupted neural pathways connected to language processing and motor skills. Children developed stutters that had not existed before the correction began. Some developed bedwetting at ages when they had already been dry for years. Handwriting suffered in both hands because the dominant one was suppressed while the non-dominant one never fully adapted. Self-esteem collapsed as children internalized the message that something fundamental about their body was defective. Studies published later by pediatric neurologists confirmed what should have been obvious. Forcing hand dominance causes measurable cognitive and emotional harm. The practice declined through the 1970s as the medical community pushed back, but it did not vanish overnight. Some teachers in rural and religiously conservative districts continued well into the 1980s. Today, roughly 10% of the global population is left-handed, and the trait is understood as a natural neurological variation, not a disorder. Back then, it was treated like a disease that school could beat out of you. For thousands of students, the scars were not on the hand. They were in the stutter, the anxiety, and the lifelong sense that something about them needed fixing. Number 2. Paddling for minor infractions. Corporal punishment in American schools was not hidden. It was institutional, widespread, and enthusiastically practiced from the 1950s through the 1980s, with pockets surviving far beyond that. The tool of choice was a wooden paddle, typically 12 to 18 inches long, made of solid hardwood, and in many cases custom crafted by shop teachers as a point of pride. Some coaches drilled rows of holes through the paddle face, not for decoration, but for aerodynamics. The holes reduced air resistance during the swing, allowing the paddle to travel faster and land harder. Teachers named their paddles. They displayed them on hooks behind their desks as a permanent visual threat. The offenses that triggered paddling were breathtakingly minor: chewing gum, passing a note, arriving late, talking without raising a hand, forgetting a pencil, a wrong answer delivered with the wrong tone. 3 to 5 swats were standard, delivered in front of the class while the student bent over a desk or grabbed their ankles. The sound carried through the walls. Students in neighboring classrooms heard every strike and understood the message without being told. The physical consequences were real: bruising that lasted a week, welts that made sitting painful for days. Some students reported bleeding. The psychological consequences were worse. Children developed school-based anxiety that mimicked the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. They flinched around authority figures. They stopped participating in class because visibility meant vulnerability. In 1977, the Supreme Court ruled in Ingraham v. Wright that school paddling did not violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. That decision effectively gave districts legal cover to continue. As of today, corporal punishment remains technically legal in 19 states, though the vast majority of schools have abandoned the practice. The paddle did not disappear because every state outlawed it. It disappeared because enough people finally recognized that beating children with a wooden board is not education. It is violence, wearing a dress code. Number 3. Boys forced to swim naked in school pools. From the 1950s through the early 1980s, many American public school districts enforced a policy requiring boys to swim nude during physical education classes. Girls wore swimsuits, boys wore nothing. This was not a rogue practice by individual teachers. It was official, printed in school handbooks, endorsed by school boards, and defended by administrators who offered a range of justifications that sound absurd today. The primary argument was hygiene. Schools claimed that fabric swimsuits shed fibers that clogged the filtration systems of their pools, and that nude swimming was therefore necessary to maintain water quality. There was no equivalent concern about girls' swimsuits, which used the same filtration systems without issue. The secondary argument was cost. Requiring families to purchase swimsuits was deemed an unreasonable financial burden, so schools simply eliminated the requirement for boys while keeping it for girls. No one addressed the inconsistency. In practice, the policy meant boys as young as 11 or 12 stood completely naked in front of their classmates and adult male instructors in communal pool areas with no partitions and no privacy. Coaches supervised from the pool deck, and refusal to participate resulted in a failing grade. Some districts held swim competitions under the same policy, meaning students competed nude in front of spectators, including parents and students from other classes. There was no option to opt out, no complaint process, and no language in the policy that acknowledged the vulnerability of the students subjected to it. The students who lived through it describe it in remarkably consistent terms: shame, powerlessness, confusion about why adults thought this was acceptable. For boys going through puberty, whose bodies were changing in visible and often embarrassing ways, the experience was particularly brutal. The policy was quietly phased out through the late 1970s and into the 1980s as community standards shifted and parents began to question what had been presented as routine. Today, the idea of requiring a child to be naked in a school setting for any reason would trigger immediate investigation, likely criminal charges, and national media coverage. It happened for decades. It was policy, and the adults who enforced it believed they were doing nothing wrong. Number 4. Pregnant students expelled immediately. Through the 1950s, 1960s, and into the early 1970s, a pregnant girl's relationship with education ended the moment her condition became visible. The expulsion was not a recommendation or a suggestion. It was automatic, codified in school board policy across thousands of American districts, and enforced without exception or appeal. A girl could be an honor student, an athlete, a student council member. None of it mattered once the pregnancy showed. She was removed from the school population immediately, often escorted from the building the same day, and in most districts barred from returning even after giving birth. There was no alternative education plan, no tutor, no path to completing her diploma within the system that expelled her. Her academic record effectively ended. The boy involved in the pregnancy faced exactly 0 institutional consequences. He remained enrolled, he attended class, he graduated. His name was never attached to any disciplinary action. The double standard was not accidental. It was structural. The policy treated pregnancy as a moral failing unique to the girl and a contamination risk to other students, as though the condition were contagious or evidence of character deficiency that could spread. For girls from low-income families, expulsion often meant the permanent end of formal education and the beginning of a cycle of economic disadvantage that carried into the next generation. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 made it explicitly illegal to expel or discriminate against students on the basis of pregnancy or parental status. But the law's passage did not produce overnight compliance. Schools found workarounds. They pressured pregnant girls to withdraw voluntarily. They transferred them to inferior alternative programs with reduced course offerings and no extracurriculars. They created environments hostile enough that leaving felt like the only option. Full enforcement took years, and for the girls who were expelled before 1972, there was no retroactive remedy. No one gave them their education back. Number 5. Racial segregation enforced in schools despite federal law. Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954. The Supreme Court declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. That was the law. What happened in actual American classrooms was something entirely different. Across the South and in many border states, school districts responded with a strategy known as massive resistance. Some districts shut down their entire public school system rather than integrate, redirecting public funds to private academies that enrolled only white students. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed its public schools for 5 years. An entire generation of black children in that county received no formal education, while white families attended taxpayer-subsidized private institutions. In districts that technically complied, compliance was performative. Freedom of choice plans allowed white families to avoid integrated schools, while black families who chose white schools faced intimidation and violence. Black students who entered white schools encountered hostility from teachers, classmates whose parents told them to make the new students unwelcome, and administrators who assigned them to the lowest academic tracks regardless of ability. Federal courts ordered busing in the 1970s, but white flight to the suburbs resegregated districts through geography rather than law. The result is that many American school districts today remain as racially segregated as they were before Brown. Integration was ordered in 1954. For many students, it didn't arrive until the 1970s or later, and in some communities, it still hasn't fully arrived at all. Number 6. Children with disabilities labeled on permanent records and warehoused in separate rooms. Before 1975, students with intellectual disabilities, learning differences, or behavioral challenges had no legal right to an appropriate public education. Schools could reject them entirely or place them wherever was most convenient for the institution, and what was convenient was usually a separate room in the basement or a portable unit behind the school. These were not special education classrooms in any modern sense. They were holding spaces. Students placed there received minimal instruction, often from aides with no training rather than certified teachers. The curriculum, if one existed, bore no relationship to grade-level expectations. Students were grouped by label, not by ability or potential, and the label was brutal. The clinical term printed on official school records was retarded. It appeared on report cards, in teacher evaluations, in files that transferred with the student from school to school and year to year. That single word shaped how every future teacher, counselor, and administrator perceived the child before meeting them. Students carrying the label were not expected to learn, progress, or graduate. They were expected to be managed until they aged out of the system. The consequences extended far beyond school. Employment opportunities, social services eligibility, and even family dynamics were shaped by what a school wrote in a file. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, signed into law in 1975, fundamentally changed the framework by guaranteeing a free and appropriate public education for all students with disabilities and requiring individualized education programs. That law evolved into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which governs special education today. But for the students who passed through the system before 1975, there was no correction. The files followed them, the label stayed, and the education they were denied was never restored. Number 7. Dunce caps and public shaming for struggling students. The dunce cap is often treated as a cartoon relic, something that belongs in old illustrations alongside quill pens in one-room schoolhouses. It wasn't a relic. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, and in isolated cases beyond that, American classrooms used the dunce cap as an active disciplinary tool for students who couldn't keep up academically. A child who answered incorrectly, failed a test, or simply didn't understand the material was made to sit on a tall stool in the corner of the classroom, facing the wall, wearing a pointed paper cone with the word dunce written on it. The position was designed to maximize visibility and shame simultaneously. The entire class could see the student. The student could see nothing but the wall. Some teachers required the child to remain there for an entire class period. Others made it a recurring punishment, placing the same student on the stool day after day until the cap became synonymous with the child's identity. Classmates didn't need to be told to mock the student. The setup did the teaching for them. The child on the stool was publicly identified as the dumbest person in the room, and every other student understood that failure would put them there next. The educational consequence was devastating and precisely opposite to the intended effect. Students who needed more support, more patience, and more individualized attention instead received isolation and ridicule. They didn't try harder. They stopped trying entirely. Some developed school avoidance so severe it resembled a phobia. Others internalized the label so deeply that decades later as adults they still describe themselves as stupid, using the exact language the classroom had assigned them at age 8 or 9. The practice died slowly as educational psychology demonstrated what common sense should have established without research. Shame does not motivate learning. It destroys the conditions under which learning becomes possible. Number 8. Public weigh-ins during gym class. In physical education classes across the 1960s and the 1970s, schools conducted mandatory weigh-ins as part of fitness assessments. The process was public, often deliberately so. Students stood on a scale in front of classmates, and in many schools, the weight was read aloud by the teacher and recorded on a chart visible to the entire class. Some schools posted the charts on gymnasium walls, turning a private medical measurement into a public ranking that every student could study, compare, and weaponize. For students whose bodies fell outside whatever the teacher considered normal, the experience was devastating. A 13-year-old whose weight was announced to 30 peers did not forget it the next period. They carried it for years. The number became a social tool. Classmates used it to bully, exclude, and rank, and they had the information because the school handed it to them. For students already vulnerable to disordered eating or body dysmorphia, the public weigh-in acted as an accelerant on existing fire. Eating disorder researchers have specifically cited public school weigh-ins from this era as triggering events in patient histories, the moment a number attached to shame, and the shame never fully detached. Modern physical education programs, when they assess body metrics at all, do so privately, with parental consent, and with results communicated confidentially. The idea that a child's weight would be announced in a gymnasium like a livestock auction now sounds grotesque. In the 1960s, it was part of the curriculum. Number 9. No bathroom breaks outside scheduled times. From the 1950s through the 1980s and even into the early 1990s in some districts, many American schools restricted student access to restrooms to specific scheduled break times. Outside those windows, the answer was no. Some teachers refused bathroom requests categorically, regardless of the student's visible distress. Others turned the request into a public interrogation, demanding that the child explain in front of the class why they needed to go and whether it was truly urgent. That conversation was designed to embarrass the student into withdrawing the request. The consequences for children who could not hold it were life-altering in the social ecosystem of a school. A student who had an accident in class carried that event like a brand. It defined them to classmates for years, sometimes for the rest of their time in that school. The nickname followed them. The story was retold at every opportunity, and the adults who created the situation by refusing a simple biological request faced no accountability whatsoever. The rule had real medical consequences as well. Chronically holding urine can cause urinary tract infections, kidney stress, and bladder dysfunction. Children who learned to suppress the urge as a survival strategy in school carried those habits into adulthood with measurable health effects. Pediatricians and urologists have documented the connection between restrictive school bathroom policies and chronic bladder issues in patients whose symptoms began in childhood. Today, most school districts recognize bathroom access as a student welfare issue, and denying a child access can trigger a formal complaint. Some states have passed legislation explicitly guaranteeing students the right to use the restroom during school hours. The shift happened because medical professionals, child welfare advocates, and parents pushed back against a rule that prioritized classroom control over the basic physical needs of the children inside it. Number 10. Girls were banned from wearing pants even in freezing weather. Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, most American public schools enforced a dress code that prohibited girls from wearing pants under any circumstances. Skirts or dresses were the only acceptable options, regardless of weather, temperature, or the physical activities planned for the day. In northern states where winter temperatures dropped well below zero, girls walked to school, waited at bus stops, and crossed open playgrounds in skirts with bare or thinly stockinged legs. Frostbitten knees and thighs were a predictable consequence that schools chose to accept rather than revise the policy. The rationale was never about practicality or safety. It was about femininity. Pants were coded as masculine, and a girl wearing them was violating a gender norm that the school felt responsible for policing. Enforcement varied by district, but it was consistently humiliating. Girls sent home for wearing pants lost instructional time. Girls forced to change at school were often given oversized, mismatched clothing from a lost and found bin, creating a visible marker of their violation. Some girls developed a workaround. They wore pants under their skirts during the commute and removed them in the restroom before class, a daily ritual of concealment that taught them their comfort was less important than the institution's image. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 began eroding gendered dress codes by establishing that schools receiving federal funding could not discriminate on the basis of sex. But legal change did not produce immediate cultural change. Some schools maintained pants bans for girls into the mid-1970s, and resistance lingered in private and religious institutions well beyond that. By the 1980s, girls wearing pants to school was unremarkable in most of America. Before that, it was an act of defiance, punished with the same seriousness as cheating or insubordination, because in the eyes of the institution, a girl choosing warmth over appearance was exactly that kind of threat. If this made you rethink what American classrooms used to look like, hit that subscribe button and leave a like so we can keep making videos like this one. More stories the textbooks left out are on the way.